Okay, as most of you are acutely aware, given the COVID crisis, we're having to deliver the courses in a very, very different manner than most of us would like to. But given this season of our journey, we'll do the best that we can with what we've got. So for this course, Ideology and Politics, what I'd like to do is for each class, I'll do a 15-minute reflection on some pertinent theme from your reading. And then I'll suggest the readings that you'll do. And as we go through the course, I'll give you hints on what's expected in terms of how I'll do the marking. So what I'd like to do today is I'm going to start with, since the course is on ideology and politics, we want to look at what is ideology and then look at some forms of it as we go along in this particular lecture. So ideology itself comes from two Greek words, ideia and logos. Ideology, logos in that sense, is the quest for meaning. Most people on their all too human journey, in some small way, want to live a meaningful life, a life of minimal substance in some way, and the decisions they make, they hope, will reflect that. And idea is the ideas that we have either in our imaginations or our heads in terms of how we hope to embody meaning in our journey. And so ideology and politics brings together the search for meaning, the quest for meaning, our attempt to understand what it means to live a meaningful life, and the ideas that we have internalized and try and externalize in our journey. Politics, and we always live in two spheres of life, the personal, the private area, family, our own internal life, which psychology attempts to understand the inner psyche of our life, or religion, the spirit, the pneuma. Politics is about how does that inner life translate into the larger public square, or the larger public arena in that sense. And so we live in two spheres. Some are more consciously and explicitly engaged in the political realm. Others don't venture as far down that road, but nonetheless, politics plays an important role in our lives. And the role of decisions made at the highest levels in politics do have an impact on us. We're obviously witnessing this very clearly with the COVID crisis, both with how is the state handling that in terms of social distancing, universities being closed down, in-class instruction at this point, and also then the many people who have been put out of work as a result of shops being closed, businesses being closed. Who's going to cover the expenses in something like that? The cost of people not being able to pay rent, not being able to cover costs in a variety of ways. Well, there's politics. That's the state. That's the federal government in Canada. And obviously the United States and Europe is trying to deal with that in its own way. And so whether a person is explicitly engaged in political life, say in Canada at a federal or provincial or a municipal level, politics does have an impact on our lives. Even the cost we pay for tuition for universal health care systems, those are decisions that are made politically, and all of us at one time or another benefit from those larger political decisions. And so when we think ideology, not only our personal attempt to search for meaning, but a nation's attempt to what does it mean as a people to live a meaningful life, and then how is that particular vision embodied in the political process through parties in Canada, through the House of Commons in Ottawa, provincially in Victoria, or in Abbotsford or cities at a municipal level. And so ideology and politics brings together the thinking of meaning and purpose and life direction, not only personally and privately and in the context of family and community, but in the bigger formal context of public life itself and the implications of that for people. So ideology and politics then brings together two important elements of our journey and then tries to make sense of that. And so when we hear the word often ideology, sometimes if you're engaged in dealing with important, controversial public political issues and someone doesn't like your perspective, they'll say, oh, you're just an ideologue, you're ideological. And you want to turn on someone like that, and you want to say, well, are not you ideological? And is not that statement ideological? Because ideology in many ways is just a tradition. It's a way of interpreting what we think is important for life, both for ourselves, our families, our communities, for religion, for a variety of other things, in economics, obviously, which is foundational to so much. And so when we hear the word ideology, sometimes it's used in a pejorative way, but at a healthier level, it merely reflects the fact everybody has ideas about what they think makes for the good, the just, the beautiful, the meaningful life. And that's where political parties will interpret those questions very differently. This is the area what we call hermeneutics, or interpretation. Hermeneutics comes from the Greek Hermes. Hermes was the god who delivered the message from Zeus to people in Athens and other places. And so he was interpreting what the divine was meant to be for the human behavior in the polis, or the city, or the public gatherings in that sense. So hermeneutics is about interpreting how we understand what is the best in terms of meaning and how we embody that in public life. And so we can never escape ideology, because ideology is a form of interpreting these big questions of the just, the good, the true, the beautiful, both in thought, word, and in deed. Now, I want to touch briefly on a couple of the larger ideologies which have shaped significant elements of the 20th century, and then move on to touch briefly some of the more controversial ideological tendencies in the hot button issues we're facing in our culture wars today. But let me just hesitate or slow down a little bit here to talk about the three elements of ideology itself. So if we look at the anatomy of ideology, there's three elements. There's the diagnosis, and if you look at page 12 of your book, I'm suggesting we use Weatherly's book, and page 12 in the book, he talks about ideology. One, it's a critique of what one sees as the problem. The second part of ideology is a vision of what one sees as the direction forward. And then the third part is a strategy for how you get there. If I can use the medical analogy, which often is used politically, when you go to a doctor, if you're not feeling well, they diagnose what the problem is. And then they offer a prognosis, which would be like point 2 in this ideology, where they talk about the vision, and then the means by which you hope to achieve that vision, or the strategy itself. And so ideology, there's three parts to it. What do you want to be free from? What do you want to be free for? And how practically are you going to achieve that particular aim? So all ideology has these three components, then what we would call the diagnosis, or in your book, the critique of what seems to be the problem, the prognosis, or what is seen as the vision or the positive way forward, and then the strategy or the means by which one hopes to move forward in a practical way. So ideology has three elements to it. Both the theoretical, that brings together what you want to be free from, what you want to be free for, and then the practical, which is the means by which, or the strategy by which, a person hopes to bring into being, imperfectly, obviously, a better way of a society being run, of people living in a certain way. And so this gives you a bit of a sense what will be the sort of the underlying structure by which ideology works is freedom from, diagnosis, freedom for, prognosis, and then the strategy or the means by which the goal we hope to, or any ideologue hopes to attain. The goal is they move from the shoreline of what they don't want on the ship of the politics across the waters to the goal or the aim of what they hope to attain. So understanding some of these things, and I said page 12 in your book by Weatherly will give you that element of ideology. Now, some of the big ideologies which have dominated in the 20th century, obviously have been the clash between communism and capitalism, and you can see how ideology works in something like that. Within communism, the argument has historically been that capitalism creates immense inequality economically. It leaves some very wealthy, others very bereft. And so the way of overcoming those inequalities is for the state to intervene in the economy, to own the means of production, and therefore overcome the inequalities that capitalism by its very nature creates. So you can see how ideology is at work there in terms of the problem is capitalism. The means of overcoming it is some form of state involvement, an ownership of the means of production, and then the end is at its best within that sort of Marxist dialectic is the classless society. So from the leftist perspective, you can see how ideology is at work. If you start from the capitalist perspective, what they'll often argue is the horrors of capitalism, and then often there's an analysis of Marxist or Engels thinking and the way it's played out, or was historically played out in the USSR under Mao in China, elements of Castro's Cuba, North Vietnam. You can go to different places like that. And so the diagnosis from a capitalist perspective is that communism leads to terrible repression of the individual's wants, their needs. It undermines creativity, and anyone who attempts in some minimal way to be creative is usually seen as the problem, imprisoned and off to Siberia, or in the Maoist revolution, freedom is lost from the very best and the brightest, and they disappear. So the ideology of the right, or some forms of liberal democracy, it sees communism as the problem you want to be free from, and variations of liberal capitalism is going to create freedom and, as much as possible, a lighter state in which people have as much freedom as possible to explore religiously, economically, literary way, and it's the role of the state to facilitate that, not to hinder individual and sovereign freedom. So two big ideologies which really dominated up to 1989, when Mikhail Gorbachev really came to the point of seeing that the communist revolution was leading to serious problems, and if something was not done, Russia was going to even further descend into chaos. And so the main works coming out at this period was that somehow the liberal democratic ideology had won the day and communism had lost. So this was the great ideological clash of the 20th century. Now, another obvious clash that many people are trying to make sense of post-Cold War ideological battles, post 9/11, is the clash between what is seen as the significance of a liberal democratic tradition and the rise of militant Islam. Now, Muslims would see, so this is a huge ideological clash within the Islamic world itself between many of the more extreme jihadist Muslims, either of the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, earlier Muslim Brotherhood, or Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. The more extreme forms of Islam are arguing modern forms of Islam have compromised the best of Islam to serve Western interests, and hence the violence towards Islam from within the Muslim community itself, which we'll be looking at as we go along. But also the West itself has taken captive best elements of Islam. And so if you're a Muslim of the jihadist variety, ideologically, you see both Islam as having compromised and the West is playing a very important role leading to that compromising of the best of the Muslim tradition. Now, obviously, if you're coming from the West ideologically, just as you saw communism is ideologically a problem that led to repression, so the argument is within a liberal democratic tradition is that Islam at its extreme versions leads to oppression and violence itself, when it doesn't get its way, just as communism did itself. So two ideological elements that we certainly will be looking at in this course. whether in the Cold War it was a liberal democratic tradition that saw communism as the problem, and communism saw the liberal democratic tradition as the problem, ideological interpretations or hermeneutics. In the West versus Islam, it's the same ideological clash. Maybe I'll just lightly linger on some of the hot button issues that are part of the culture wars at the present time. If someone is usually on the political right, there's a laundry list of issues which they see as leading to a better society. And so whether it's a single issue or a cluster of issues, say abortion, euthanasia, traditional family values, law and order issues, market economy. So there's a whole variety, a certain critique, obviously, of secularism as an ideology. So if a person's coming from the right, they're going to see elements of the liberal left is highly problematic. So ideologically, their ideas of what leads to the most substantive elements of meaning are going to cluster around a series of social, religious, economic, political ideas. If you're coming from what's called the more progressive wing, there'll be issues of freedom, say when it comes to abortion, euthanasia, redefining gender, identity questions, racist issues, a greater commitment to environmental concerns, usually a greater sense of statist involvement in the economy, distributions of good, higher taxes in that sense. These are two ideological traditions that are on war within a liberal democratic tradition, which one is defined as conservative, the other is seen as liberal, and we'll be getting to this in much more depth and detail as we go through the course. So there are the bigger ideological issues that have dominated the 20th century, liberalism and communism. There's some of the whole Islamic liberal democratic tradition ideology that's work. And then within the Western liberal tradition, there's, as it were, within that family itself, there are ideological clashes about how does one interpret in a meaningful way the good life, what political parties best embody that, and how is liberalism as an ideology to make sense of itself. This course, because most of us are embedded within a liberal democratic tradition, we're going to start with the ideology of liberalism itself, both look at the underlying principles or premises or prejudices of liberalism, and then look at how those play themselves out in the content issues of the hot button issues of the culture wars. And so this next lecture I'm going to do for you will look at the origins of liberalism, or what's called classical liberalism. Then we'll move on to look at modern liberalism, and then we'll finish with what's called postmodern liberalism, looking at how the principles of liberalism have, for the most part, remained the same over the last 500 or 600 years, but the content of those principles changes as the certain elements of the content of liberalism, brakes are put on it, and the next generation, what we call second or third or fourth generation liberalism, wants to push the content into new areas in which individuality and choice and agency and freedom and equality are expressed, dealt with. But that will take us into our next lecture, which will deal with the ideological origins of liberalism and look at what we call the first generation of liberalism, or classical liberalism. And so if you can, for the course, be reading obviously chapter 1 in Weatherly's book, and be moving into chapter 2 and 3, which really deal with the issues of what is liberalism as an ideology. Because, as I mentioned, the ideology, we don't live in China, we don't live in Africa, we don't live in Russia, we don't live in Latin America. We live in North America, which has been shaped by a Mediterranean, European tradition, of which liberalism is the dominant ideology. And we'll be wanting to look at any critical thinker when you think ideology. The key is to ask, what is the good of any ideology, but what may be the blind spots of an ideology? What might be the Achilles heel? And The danger of any ideology is we demonize what we are not and we idealize our own particular worldview. And the healthy understanding of thinking politically and meaning is to always know how to be self-critical and also be willing to hear the insights of others. And it gets very dangerous. You get into the worst form of ideology when a person is uncritical about their own perspective, which we get in certain elements of social justice warriors today, and the other person is totally wrong in their outlook and they have no good and they're oppressive and they're totalitarian, and there's all sorts of rhetorical words by which people are fire hosed in that. But at this point, this first lecture then is just to introduce the issue of ideology. We are all ideological. The three elements of ideology, diagnosis, prognosis, means used, or strategy. I briefly touched on some of the big ideologies that have dominated the 20th century and lightly lingered over some of the hot button issues in the culture wars, which tend to divide ideologically people within a liberal democratic tradition. My next lecture, then, I will move on to the origins of liberalism as an ideology and the classical notion of liberalism.